All right, Jason, go ahead and take it away.
Cool. Yeah, so it's been a few years. I think I spoke at this meetup back in 2020 or 2021, about a completely different subject, but I'm still at the same place. My name is Jason Hill. I'm a data scientist at Rally, and we've been looking at different started off with the smart CFD, and then kind of moving into flow metrics and more forecasting and prediction type of things, which is what I'm going to be talking about, the forecasting stuff today. So in terms of more or less an icebreaker, you probably saw in the meetup page, there was me with a baby elephant that weighs like 500 pounds. My wife and I volunteered at elephant sanctuary in northern Thailand, and we sponsor 2 of the elephants there. And one of the elephants that we sponsor, her name is Sri Prey, and she's, it's in Thailand. She's a female Asian elephant. They're endangered. There's only about 30,000 of them in the world, total Asian elephants. Compared to a lot of people think of like African elephants, there's about 300 to 450,000 African elephants, about a tenth as many Asian elephants. So they wouldn't even, all fill like Folsom Field. Not that Folsom Field gets filled right now anyway. But she was rescued from the logging industry in Thailand after she stepped on a landmine. So like the photo that's kind of the second from the left, you can kind of see her foot is a little bit dark. It's because she has to have it cleaned, and there's antiseptic that's put on it every couple of days. But she is one of the elephants that we sponsor. There's 2 elephants that are in these photos. She's the main elephant there. You can see her in the right photo. She's grabbing a watermelon, and she's just going to put that whole thing in her mouth. That photo is taken about like less than a minute before I proposed to my now wife, in front of our 2 elephants, which is kind of cool, right? And the other elephant there, the one that's sticking his trunk out, her name is Jokia. She's blind, which is why she's sticking her trunk out. She's trying to figure out what's going on, and you don't want to get in the way of an elephant sticking its trunk out. One, they're huge. Sri Prey's trunk is probably about as heavy as I am. I'm like 6'2", 200 pounds. That's probably about what her trunk is, right? One of the questions I have though, like I don't think a lot of people here, it's reasonable to expect that not many people here are experts in elephants. And so one of the things I want to ask is, how much do you think Sri Prey weighs? And if you could give it in pounds, one of the members of my team is here, Alan. He's going to kind of look at everybody's answer, put it in the chat. He's going to look at everybody's answer and kind of see what the average is here. And we're going to see how well, and like I said, I don't expect you to be an expert in elephants. Like our answers are kind of going to be, varied quite a bit, right? We expect that. That's one of the things we're going for here. But just kind of guess like what you think she weighs, right? And so there's a lot of good answers coming into the chat right there. While Alan does this, I'm gonna the same pictures are on the next slide, so you can keep guessing if you're trying to figure out how much. By the way, I will point out, so she was born in 1990, compared to Jokia, who is the elephant on the right in the farthest right photo. Jokia is up in her late 60s right now. They're kind of best friends. And one of the interesting photos, that photo that's kind of the second to the right, somebody sent me recently, and it's interesting because Sri Prey, as humans get old, they turn gray. As elephants, specifically Asian elephants, get old, they turn pink. And so the difference between some of the photos here, the last time that I was in northern Thailand and volunteering with them, and that photo, like she's turned a lot more pink, I've turned a lot more gray. So we're kind of progressing at the same rate. But yeah, one of the questions we could ask here is, if you wanted to know, so this is kind of what we're asking right now, what's the best approximation if you don't have a scale? Weighing an elephant, like you have to have a big scale. The elephant sanctuary we go to, they do have a scale. They can weigh elephants, but even with having a scale, it's kind of hard to figure out, to get the elephant to actually go stand on the scale. Somebody's posting in the chat, I see one photo on the meetup and no screen share. Do we know what's going on there?
So I would probably recommend, Todd, that you maybe try and leave the meeting and rejoin.
Okay.
See if that resets some things.
All right. So what do you think is going to work better? And this is one of the areas where I'll tell you right away, humans have a specific way of approaching certain problems that don't necessarily end up being the best way of approaching them. And there have been a lot of experiments that have been done in this area to figure out kind of what's the best way to do this. If you wanted to weigh an elephant, you don't have scale. You could ask an expert, that's your first option. So a mahout, somebody who trains elephants on a daily basis, or a vet who is an expert on elephants. Or would you ask many random people who don't know anything about elephants? So you could ask an expert, or you could ask a whole bunch of people that know nothing about elephants. But what do you think is going to be the best course of action here in terms of figuring out how much the elephant weighs? And Alan, I think everybody has kind of voted at this point. If you could post what the average weight for the choices here are. But I'll move forward here. What ends up happening, and this has been tested and experimented on over and over again, if you ask a large number of people that don't have expert knowledge or context, somehow you end up getting a better answer usually, right? Instead of asking the expert. So Sri Prey's, so the average weight of Sri Prey, this is actually kind of awesome. The average weight of your guesses for how much Sri Prey weighs was 4,512. She weighs 4,500 pounds. So well done. Now, those answers were all across the board, right? But somehow as a group, we were able to figure out a fairly accurate approximation, right? So that worked out actually better than I was expecting it to, right? So that's kind of interesting. So when you think about asking an expert, why might an expert not be good at approximating? Well, the thing is, like, a single expert isn't bad. If you were to ask a whole bunch of experts, they might actually be pretty good overall, but they generally can't beat a crowd, right? And so there's multiple reasons for this. And if you're familiar with the podcast Planet Money, they actually did a podcast on this, and it was pretty incredible because what they did is they took a picture of a cow and they posted it on their Twitter account, and they said, what is the weight of this cow? So it's sort of similar to what we just did. They said, by the way, when you respond, let us know if you are an expert on cows. And so they took all of the responses, 17,000 of them overall, and they looked at who is an expert and who is not an expert, and the non-experts actually beat the experts. And there's kind of a lot going on there, because what was happening with the experts, people who are farmers or vets who work with bovines, so on, they had certain bias built into their what they were judging. They're like, oh, well, this cow looks a certain age, and I think by that age they're going to start to lose weight and so on, and here's how I'm going to overthink this problem. Whereas with the crowd, there's many variants of this. It's like, how many marbles are in the jar? You know, the kind of the you know, your typical like county fair style questions. Overall, we can figure this out, but nobody actually knows the answer. A single non-expert opinion is not going to be reliable. We know that. So like, I mean, we look at some of the answers that were in the chat here, and yeah, they're good answers. Some people were saying like 500 pounds, 1,000 pounds, 10,000 pounds. An average female Asian elephant is around 6,000 to 7,500 pounds. Sri Pei is actually kind of small. The male elephants, they do have a female elephant at the sanctuary that is up around like 12,500 pounds. She's huge. Male Asian elephants can get up around 15,000 pounds. They're enormous, like absolutely enormous. But the idea here is that the more non-expert opinions you have, the better our approximation becomes. This is one of the areas where humans are just kind of bad at statistical, probabilistic thinking, and we'd rather trust the knowledge of a single expert than kind of trust the crowd. But when we do experiments, we find that for whatever reason, a lot of people who should not be knowledgeable about this can do better. So immediately, just kind of like, how do you use this right off the bat in terms of, you know, what can we do in the Agile world? Well, story points are best done as a group, right? And you might have experienced, like, if you have a team where like one person is an expert on how to develop a specific thing, we ask them, what do you think the story points on this are? When really, even though that person is the expert, you should probably be asking the entire team, and we should try to figure it out as an entire team, because you're going to have context. Like maybe the dev manager knows that every time we try to approach this problem, something happens. Even though the code might be easy, this thing happens, and that's what I'm worried about. That's what's sticking out in my mind, right? And you could say the same for portfolio items. So if you're trying to size a feature, you know, various different sizing metrics for features, whether you're using SAFe or whatever. But then you kind of have the opposite approach, and we already kind of build these things into Agile rituals. Even though we don't really think of it, they're already kind of built in there because we know that this is kind of how the world works. If you have a fist of 5 and everybody's throwing 4s and 5s except for one person who throws a 1 or a 2, you want to know why, right? So if everybody's saying the elephant weighs 10,000 pounds, but one person says, I think the elephant weighs 1,000 pounds, you kind of look at that and you're like, I kind of want to know what your perspective is here and why our views are different. We do kind of already build these things in, right? So I'm going to try to not be very technical here. We all kind of know what pi is. And so I do have a couple of slides here that talk about pi. My only real math question, like, how would you approximate pi? Say like an alien came down to Earth and they wanted to know what pi was. They've never heard of this thing. They know what circles and squares and things are, but they don't know what pi is. How might you describe what pi is, or give you know, you can't memorize it. It's infinitely long. you can give an approximation to it. And so how might you give an approximation to it? You could look it up in a book, you could, all these different things. But if you're a programmer, what do you do? One of the, I include this because I find this really kind of comical. Indiana actually tried to legislate the value of pi, which is really amusing. This happened over 100 years ago, but it did actually happen. They tried to legislate it to 3.2, mostly for like surveying efforts and so on. But still, that's definitely not a great approach. We tend as humans to go for a precise method, right? We want a single answer. And that's kind of an interesting approach. When it really comes down to it, a lot of times the non-precise answer that ends up coming out a little bit differently every time ends up working out a little bit better. And so what I'm showing you here is just some Python code that approximates pi. And all it's doing is it's throwing darts at a board that's like 2 by 2 with a circle in it, and figuring out how many things land in the circle and how many things don't land in the circle, and using that to figure out pi. In the end, this is one of the fastest ways to get an approximation to pi. It's totally using randomness though. And so there's a huge discrepancy between all of the sort of the complicated, very, very precise ways that we do to compute things, and saying, well, I can compute this and I'll do it not exactly. And actually, every time you run this code, you'll get a slightly different answer. But if you run it over and over and over again, you'll see that those things clump around what is actually pi. And so that's one of the ideas that we're kind of using here. All right, so can probability statistical methods help us plan in an agile environment? So there's a couple of ideas here. Usually when we're thinking about something like capacity planning, where, you know, I want to know how many things my team will do in the next release, or program increment, program interval, if you're using SAFe 6.0, apparently. You want to know how many things your team can do. And you can look at throughput in terms of number of stories, and you can look at velocity in terms of, you know, the total of plan estimate values, story points, if you're using those. One thing I will say is, being a data scientist at Rally, I try to be agnostic in these areas and just kind of understand what people are doing and how they want to do it. And so I'm not going to tell you that you have to use story points, right? Or that you shouldn't use story points. Either way, I'm more interested in knowing how you're doing it and how to help you do it. So instead of looking at a single exact solution where I'm saying, I want to help my team plan for the next PI, I think we can do 60 stories. And I think that's going to amount to 120, 130 story points or something, right? That's a single value. And so we kind of put that, you know, in our capacity planning page at Rally, and we kind of stick it right there and say, that's exactly what we're going to do. Instead of that, look for a range of values. I know, instead of looking at doing, you know, 60 stories, I think I'm going to do somewhere between 40 and 80, and I have different confidence values along there. I'm pretty sure we can do at least 40. Hitting 80 would be a huge stretch, so I'm not very confident in that. But somewhere between there, I'm fairly confident. And let's let statistical models do the heavy lifting for us and give us a range of options of where we're going to end up along this spectrum is kind of the idea. That's the main thought that we're looking at here. And I will say, like, we have built this into Rally. I will try to provide some references at the end, some resources of where else, if you're not using Rally, where you can kind of go to get this. And if you are using Rally, it's a beta thing. We can turn you on so you have access to it. So one of the main sorts of probabilistic algorithms we have are called Monte Carlo algorithms. These are named after the Monte Carlo casino in Monaco. And so on the left there, that's a photo that I took of the Monte Carlo casino because my wife and I were there. And that's my wife on the right. And I don't know if you know much about Monaco, but about a third of the people who live in Monaco are millionaires. They're actually banned from going into the Monte Carlo casino. They can't gamble if they're a citizen of Monaco. It's kind of interesting. But yeah, on the right, I had that fairly mediocre Monaco beer. My wife had a small ice cream and a wine, and I checked a couple of days ago, that total came out to like $48. So a little bit, like it's a pretty pricey area. We parked for something like 2.5 hours, and I think the parking bill was like $30 something. It's a pricey area. There are a couple of different classes of probabilistic algorithms, and they're largely categorized as Las Vegas and Monte Carlo. Las Vegas ones are ones that are, they're very highly regulated, and they'll come up with the same answer every single time. Monte Carlo algorithms will come up with a slightly different answer every time you run them. So that's one thing to keep in mind here. If we're going to use Monte Carlo algorithms to do capacity forecasting and plan forecasting, we have to know that every single time we run them, we might come up with a slightly different answer. So that's just one of the things I want to kind of point out. So in terms of using Monte Carlo for capacity forecasting, this is what we have. This is kind of the beta version of what we have built into Rally's team board charts right now. And like I said, there are other ways of getting to this. If you know your throughput, the number of cards that you're putting through on a daily or weekly basis, and your velocity, if you're pointing your cards and you know how much you're putting through in terms of points on a daily or weekly basis. This is what a plan looks like for my team doing a 12-week plan. And we haven't really adjusted some of the other parameters because our team is fairly stable right now. You can see at the bottom our weekly historical throughput and velocity. Of course, that's going to vary, right? What's going to happen is you're going to have weeks when the team is, we might have vacations happening or holidays, and we might have planning weeks. We might have hackathons. That was really recent at Rally. We do a hackathon week, and then we do a planning week right after it. So for 2 weeks straight, a lot of times we don't have a lot of throughput and velocity. And so we kind of need to be able to account for that. If I'm saying I want to plan for 12 weeks, well, what does that mean? So there is some context built in there, and there's some details. But when I look at this, what it's telling me is, instead of saying, so these graphs, the top one shows throughput, the bottom one shows, or the middle one shows velocity, it's giving me a range of what I think I'm capable of over the course of a PI or a release, if that's 12 working weeks. And in the middle, if I were to hover over this in Rally, it would say basically like 60 for the throughput value. And I will say a lot of people who are doing this in industry, they're mostly working with throughput. Some of the people who have developed more of these algorithms to do this, you're looking at like Troy McGinnis and Dan Vicanti. They tend to be fairly heavily Kanban based. So they're going to be looking at throughput, the number of cards, more than velocity. But like I said, we're looking at either. We do have teams at Rally that, like our DevOps teams, tend to not point a lot of their stories, or they're just pointed ones always. but they're mostly using throughput values, right? So what this graph is telling me is that kind of in the middle, the median point on this chart, and this is in beta, we've refined the front end of this multiple times, and I think this is probably an older screenshot, but like I said, if anybody has access to Rally and wants access to this, it's on the team board charts right now. We're only doing it at the team level. We're going to raise this to the train level where we probably won't do velocity, because velocity rolled up to a train doesn't always make sense. All the different teams are going to plan differently. But if anybody wants access to this, just reach out and we can give you access. But it's giving me a range. And so I can look at this and I can say, okay, I know the context of my team. I know there's going to be a certain amount of vacations that people are going on. Maybe somebody's going on medical leave. Maybe we're tackling a problem that is more complex than what we've done in the past, and it might slow us down. I can use kind of expert level context on top of this to kind of judge. And so we go from a point where we're asking like, okay, well, before we would ask for capacity prediction, and it would be up to, say, somebody like the Scrum Master to put all of these things together, right? How much is my team going to be capable of, but also all of these context level items, vacation and sick time, or the complexity of what we're working on, like all of that. It would be up to the Scrum Master, say, to just put that into the plan, to be the expert. And what we're trying to do is to provide more of a historical based, here's how your team functions and here's how we think you're going to act if you continue to act in the ways that you have in the past. So how does this work? The way that the capacity forecaster works, and this is the way that all of the people who are doing this in industry, this is how they're doing it. You can either do weekly or daily. We're doing weekly right now. Compile a list of your historical weekly throughputs and velocities. Remove your outliers. If you're going to plan for 10 working weeks and you know you have a hackathon and a planning week at the end of that, and you're not going to be producing anything during those weeks, then just plan for 10 weeks. And so we remove the outliers that are the low-lying weeks, right? Consider how many weeks you want to plan. And really what we're doing is we're looking at those weeks that you have done previously, and we're just sampling them randomly and adding them together. And we're doing it about 10,000 times, right? So if you have some weeks where you produce a lot and other weeks where you don't produce very much, we're going to be sampling those weeks and adding them together. And sure, sometimes we'll sample some of your high production weeks more often and add them together, and we'll get a higher value for your capacity. Sometimes we'll sample your low weeks and add them together. But in the end, probabilistically, we should get a good representation overall, and kind of the middle point of where this distribution is kind of the sweet spot. It's kind of like if you're used to something like sports betting, it's kind of the over under. We know you're going to be somewhere around this point, but we'll let you provide the context around, you know your team, you know what challenges you're up against now, and so you can move this however much. But we're just kind of telling you we're this confident. If you're 50% of the way through this distribution, we're about 50%. You're probably going to at least do, over under that amount of points. One of the other things we do, Rally does this. I don't think a lot of other people in the industry do this. We do preference more recent data. So right now what we're doing is we're taking a year of historical data for your team, if it exists. If it doesn't exist, then we go back however long your team has existed. As long as they've actually been producing things, you could create a team and then not flow anything through that team's board for a month or two, and we're not going to count that. We actually want you to be flowing things through the board for sampling, but we do want to preference sampling of more recent data, right? So this is one of the first things we can do with a basic Monte Carlo forecast. And like I said, my last slide has some points to where to go if you're not a Rally customer. There are some spreadsheets, like Troy McGinnis made one. It's out there. And Actionable Agile, they have some of these tools. But this is kind of one of the most basic things you can do with a Monte Carlo forecast, is to remove bias and use pure statistical probabilistic methods to look at what your team has done and to forecast out what we think they're capable of, right? The second thing is we do have a team that's called Pluck from the Vine. I just took this screenshot. This is kind of in a proof of concept mode right now, which is why there's no graph. But the main idea being that, if you're telling teams that we have an idea that you can get a certain amount done, then one of the things that we can do is we can kind of flip that on its head, and we can look at how much you have in the plan, how much have you committed to, and based on your throughput and velocity metrics from the past, how confident are we that you will get a certain amount done in a certain amount of time? Right. And so if your team, if we say that you're, with your capacity forecast that we think you're going to do 60 items, and then you plan 100, or you steer things in without steering things out, and you end up at 100 items, we can use the same sort of technique. Instead of adding up your throughputs week by week, we can say, okay, let's sample your previous weeks and start chopping things down. And we'll do that 10,000 times, and we'll see where you end up. And for this team, this is a simulation that was run back earlier in May. And what we can do is we can look at, for the things that this team has committed to, the time box end, whether that's an iteration or a release or PI, we were 36% confident that this team would finish all of the things that they've committed to by that point. One of the things we want to do is to provide the detail in Rally that says, all right, here's where our confidence is, and here's how it changes by day. You moved a couple of things out of scope, and our confidence that you're going to deliver by your set delivery date, here's how it changed, and here's why. You moved some things out. You went from 36% confidence in finishing by the end of your time box to 95% confidence by actually delivering the things that you're saying that you will deliver. It's really the same algorithm worked in a different way, right? And so you compile a list of historical daily throughputs and velocities, and you really, instead of counting up, you count down. And you look at how long it takes for items to get depleted from what you're saying you can deliver. You sample this, 10,000 plus times, and see how many days it's going to take, and then look at what those dates are. It's really kind of the same algorithm, but it's done in a different way. The way that we're doing this right now is almost exclusively based on throughput. It's not looking at velocity. We do, in terms of MVP deliverables, we're looking at throughput, and that's how a lot of other people in the industry, when they're looking at this is how they're looking at it. We do have a goal of looking at velocity and looking at story points and cycle times and how those might relate or not relate, and then start sampling those things. There's a lot of different areas that you can go here. But the basic version of really just looking at throughput and chopping away seems to actually be fairly accurate and fairly useful, and it's fairly easy to compute. So in terms of resources, and I'll ask for questions here in a bit, and I can leave this slide up for a bit. If you do have access to Rally, we are kind of looking for people that want access to this and want to give us feedback about it. We're doing the capacity forecaster, that's in beta. The delivery forecaster, that should be coming this quarter. Dan Vacanti, he wrote a book called Actionable Agile Metrics for Predictability, which was, there's a lot of CFD information in there. And we were kind of inspired by that. Our smart CFD at Rally is different, but it's definitely similar. But we definitely have some differences. But then after that, he wrote a book called When Will It Be Done? And the idea with using the smart CFD was to get your team predictable. And then once your team is predictable, because you don't want to be making forecasts for a team that is not predictable. If their CFD is all over the place and not smooth, then you probably want to figure that out, and then you can work into predicting when your team will accomplish specific tasks. If you do it before that point, before they're predictable, it's not going to make a whole lot of sense. But his When Will It Be Done book, I think that's been more well received in the Agile community compared to the previous book. It's basically talking about exactly this. The algorithms aren't hard. They're pretty easy to code if you have any coding or experience, or you can do them in Excel. Yeah, Actionable Agile has some of this stuff built in. They're now owned by 55 Degrees, a Swedish company based in Malmö. And like I said, Troy McGinnis, there are spreadsheets out there. And basically, you take your team's throughput or velocity and look at how many things they're looking at doing now. And in Excel, you can actually write some of these algorithms, which is actually kind of nice. So if you just have like Jira data for a team, you can look at throughput and look at how many things you have planned, and you can do a Monte Carlo simulation just using Excel. Yeah, and in terms of elephants, I just had to put this in here. You know, if you want to volunteer with an arguably sentient endangered animal, there are places you can do it. Please don't ride elephants. Please don't buy their paintings, etc. Circuses where they're taught to do certain things. And then this documentary down here is kind of what inspired me. I wanted to volunteer with an endangered animal in some way, and that documentary kind of pushed me over the edge. But it's not all happy. There's some rough stuff in there. So I'll keep this slide up if anybody wants to write things down. I was trying to find Troy McGinnis's Excel spreadsheets earlier today, and I think so yeah, somebody asked, do you have an Excel template? What I'm going to do is get those. I know somebody that has them, but I didn't get them. Oh, and it's available on Twitter. So awesome, cool. So this is in the chat. So that's really cool. So somebody posted a link in the chat. Thank you, Elizabeth, for doing that. So I think probably the best area to go right now is to open it up for questions. Does anybody have questions?
go ahead and take yourself off mute and you can ask your question or you can put it in the chat. I'm happy to kind of get things kicked off here. Jason, I'm a little bit curious, just, having been an Agile coach, you did mention, using historical data, and I see that a lot of this data you have these are very established teams. And as Agile coaches, we do talk a lot about not weaponizing metrics and data. So I don't know if you could speak a little bit about that. How do you create a culture where everybody's kind of speaking the same speak, and we're not manipulating data or leveraging data?
Yeah, you can always, especially if you're under pressure, you can always game the data, right? And so there's a couple of things to be said there, like looking at, so this is an area where I kind of agree. Oh, and I should have put, Dan Vacanti also has a podcast called Drunk Agile. And they're at like 60 to 70 episodes at this point. And so you should check that out. But really one of the main things is, like, if you are gaming the metrics, to some extent, you are going to not be predictable, right? You're doing things for a reason other than making yourself predictable and knowing what your team is capable of. So there's a lot that can be said here, right? You, as a Scrum Master or Dev Manager or Product Owner, you want your team to be predictable because you want your plans to be successful. And if you are pressured into gaming your metrics, then it makes you non-predictable, which in the end has the side effect that you probably won't be successful in your plans, at least not as likely to be successful in your plans. And so it's kind of a double-edged sword, right? I do like the idea of using something like a CFD. And when I say a CFD, I mean an actual, like a modern CFD, a CFD that never goes down, right? It's cumulative. It never goes down. If, I want to know not only what was on a team's board and what they deleted and moved out of their plan, but I am mainly concerned with what they delivered. It's really, from a product standpoint, it's the main thing that you're interested in. You want to get your CFD smooth so that it goes up at kind of a constant rate. You don't want these jumps to happen, right? You don't want bands within your CFD to expand so that you have a whole lot in width. Getting predictable there. And so that's a kind of a lesson in figuring out how to be predictable. And then once you're predictable, then you can use these tools for forecasting. I think jumping into forecasting before you have a good understanding of where your team is predictable or not predictable, not understanding that, jumping into forecasting is probably a bad idea, right? So yeah, predictability is equal to trust. Yeah, you have working agreements, you know how everything's going. Nobody's feeling pressured and feeling like they need to make the metrics better than they actually are, right? So that's kind of a key component to being able to do these things. We have actually seen a couple of teams that are testing this out, and I can't really say who. We have seen some weird distributions of the capacity forecaster, where instead of being this nice smooth curve, it's kind of this bimodal weird two lump thing. And what's happening is that teams aren't recording their work appropriately. They might have like a 3-week iteration, and basically they have an idea that nobody's looking at their board during the iteration. And so at the end of the iteration, they just push everything across. And so a third out of all of their weeks are going to be very high velocity or throughput weeks, right? And you can kind of understand how this would happen if a team doesn't think that somebody's looking at their stuff and they're just at the end of the iteration, they need to be held accountable for what was on their board and just make sure that it's moved across. But through the iteration, they don't really have that idea of this is important to actually move things across. Yeah, so cliff dive. Then you kind of understand that if you try to build a forecast out of that data, it's not going to be reliable, right? And so this comes down to a conversation of you have to let your devs know that doing like planning these things appropriately and actually moving them across the board is important to the organization. We're not just looking at the overall metrics of what we produce during a PI or a release. We're actually looking at how predictable the team is. And we want to plan and execute our work better so that our team, we know exactly what we can do during any given time box. All right, that was a long response. Does somebody have a hand up?
Yes, Tim.
That's my hand. Hey, so you were talking about you're mainly driven off of throughput. And I saw another take on this not long ago, and they had like they used like velocity, and then had another variable that drove calculations like how well do you think you defined your scope? In other words, if you sat here and go, oh well, you open up a story and you start working on it, and you go, oh crap, this generated 3 other stories that really need to be done for the project to be done. It was like a metric for that too, that it also put into the Monte Carlo simulation. So have you played around with, having some of these other factors come in, or?
Yeah, I mean, if you're in a SaaS organization, you're probably going to have other things that you have to consider, such as, defects that come in from customers, and you want to tackle these in kind of a parallel track a lot of times. And so I think this is, so it's a good question. The way that we've been tackling this so far is when we plan at Rally, a lot of our teams will plan to a specific percentage of capacity, right? And so we'll look at what we want to get done during what the planned work that we want to get done during a PI, and we'll say that accounts for 75% of our capacity. There will be extra things outside of there, and so this kind of gets into specific context around your team. So if you think about what you had delivered in the previous PI, we're looking at user stories and defects specifically in Rally. We're not actually including like test cases and test suites and things like that, right? And so that includes the things that were not planned. That's just how much throughput and velocity that you had. And so if you know that reliably, or unreliably, you're going to have to change the context here because you're going to have a certain amount of unplanned work in your capacity allocation. And you're going to have some defects you need to work on that'll come in from customers, or you'll have security work that you need to change some of the code because it doesn't, there's some security vulnerability that came out. If you see those trends over time, you can start to account for, what percentage of your work are those and how much should you plan. So if I'm told that, my over under my 50% line for my median for capacity forecasting is 60 cards, but I know, let's say 1/6 out of everything I worked on was a defect, then I know I should probably only plan 50 cards, right? And so there is like definitely context that has to be added on top of this, right? And that's where somebody who's an expert on the team, a scrum master, product owners, dev managers, this is definitely a place where they come in.
Okay, thank you.
We do have a question in the chat.
So the question looks like SAFe aims to normalize SP across teams on the release train to understand capacity. Just wondering how Monte Carlo works for forecasting product delivery done by multiple teams. That's a good question. Generally, so the way that we've approached this problem, and we've kind of had this discussion on trying to normalize what if we're actually, and so I'm thinking of this from a velocity standpoint, what it means for a card to be a 1, a 2, if you use like Fibonacci, for instance, a 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, hopefully no. And so the problem that we run into is that different teams, no matter what, are going to plan things differently. We've actually seen a team recently say that they want to plan things with higher points because instead of doing 1, 2, 3, and maybe a 5 every now and then, having the difference between the numbers be bigger feels like it makes the difference between the cards more important. And so they are intentionally lifting up their plan estimate values, their story points, because there's kind of the psychological difference there. That all being said, every single person, every single team in a train is going to, approximate things differently. And so when we look at doing this, and we are like, I have started looking at this from a portfolio, feature level, train level perspective. And in that context, the higher up you go in a train, really you are limited to throughput. The more you start putting teams together, the more you're limited to throughput. We have some teams at Rally that over a quarter, their velocity prediction might be 90. And then other teams that are of somewhat similar structure that might have a velocity prediction of 210, right? And it's just, we let those teams plan as they plan internally. And we've kind of, I don't think we're going to really focus too much on rolling up the train level velocity as much as the train level throughput. Does that kind of make sense? It may be possible. You may be able to correlate these things if you threw some fancy algorithms at them, but so far, the higher up you go, if you go more than one team or more than 2 teams that are driven by the same, dev manager and scrum master, then you probably really just want to look at throughput.
Thank you, Tim, for that question. Thank you, Tyler. Is there any other problems we want to solve tonight? Is there anything else anybody wants to bring up as something to discuss?
I'm going to copy some of these links that people are posting because they're pretty good.
Yeah. Jason, how are, if anybody's interested in giving some feedback with what you had mentioned, like having some access to some sort of testing environment for Raleigh software with what you're doing. How might some of these individuals have access to that?
Oh yeah. So if you are in Raleigh, reach out to me. We're owned by Broadcom. So I put my link, my email in the chat. If you are using Raleigh, you can reach out to me, and yeah, we're happy to turn anybody on for the betas that we're doing. If you're a programmer, you could. I think the Troy McGinnis Monte Carlo Excel spreadsheets that somebody posted, there's a Twitter link up above. That's probably the next place where I'd go. He did write a book that is incredibly dense, and I don't recommend it. And actually, at this point, he doesn't recommend it. I would read Dan Vacanti's book, When Will It Be Done, if you want to know how this works. It's not like the basic version of how this works is not very challenging. So you can make it work in an Excel spreadsheet, which it sounds like Troy McGinnis has those available now. Just you can go download them. He does also offer it's like a $75 course that you can take to kind of understand more what's going on. And some people might be interested in that. I mean, I don't think it's. Here, I'm going to stop sharing here. Yeah. So I think the resources are out there. The algorithms aren't too challenging. We do want to move in a direction at Raleigh where we're doing things in a more intelligent way. I will say the Monte Carlo forecasting, so the delivery forecaster, it really works well over a long period of time. Like if you have a PI that's like a quarter, it tends to work fairly well. The closer you get to the end of that quarter, the less it works. And nobody's really addressed this. And I have a solution to it, but we're kind of like poking around with it at Raleigh right now and looking at shorter things. Like if you have a 2-week iteration, you want to know how successful your iteration will be. And here's one of the main points of doing this forecasting. You want to look at this like every day. You want to see how the forecast changed, right? If you think of forecasting like weather, you can look out 10 days from now, but it's not going to be very accurate. If you look back at, I'm going to be having a barbecue on July 4th. I want to know what the weather's going to look like. If I look out 10 days, it's probably not going to be very accurate. But the closer that July 4th gets, the more accurate that forecast becomes. And so looking at this day over day kind of becomes a thing that you want to do, right? And so one of the things we are looking at Raleigh are kind of some neat ways of being able to forecast things that are, only a week or two away. How much am I going to deliver that? Is my iteration going to be successful, right? So we do want to go there, but it's sort of our MVP right now is the capacity forecaster and the kind of the basic version, the release version of the PI version of the forecaster for delivery. Will my PI be successful? Anyway.
So Jason, who do you work closely with? Not a lot of us have access to data analysts in our own organizations. So who do you work closely with at Raleigh to make this successful?
My product owner is Will Carlin. I don't know if a lot of people here know him. Alan Brockett is also my dev manager. He's on the call here. He's more of a long-term Raleigh person that other people might know. It's mainly those of us that are driving this at Rally are mostly kind of the three of us, right? And working with a lot of our customers that want this sort of thing and talking with them to figure out what works and what doesn't, right? Yeah, we're a pretty small group, but we're kind of rocking it right now, so it's kind of awesome.
That's great to have that momentum. What are you willing to share some things that don't work so we can have a little bit of insight into those lessons learned?
Well, I'll share one of the challenges we've had. Figuring out exactly, if you're going to automate, pulling the historical data and figure out what you don't want, right? If I, and this is always going to happen, this is, it's just kind of a data problem. If I look at a team for the past, say, I know a team has been active for the past year, and I look at their throughput by week or by day for the past year, some of that data is not reliable because they're, most people in software engineering go away for Christmas. I don't want to use that data. If I'm looking at, they have 10 weeks, say they have 10 weeks that they're going to plan to execute on work. I don't want to be sampling weeks when they're not working, right? And so one of our biggest challenges is figuring out which weeks do you actually care about. And so the automated solution to that would be like, well, always remove Christmas. Teams have planning and hackathon weeks that can throw a wrench into things. But any automated approach that you throw at this is going to be bad. Like, the team has to know which weeks do I want to use. So that's one of the things we're actually trying to do now. It's not an easy problem. Which weeks do you actually want to include from your previous data? Now, the nice thing is, if you are a team that's looking at this externally and loading your data from whatever source, be it Rally or Jira or wherever, all of that context, right? Nobody worked over Christmas or the week before New Year's. Nobody really worked on Thanksgiving week. So if I'm going to actually plan out 10 useful working weeks, I'm not going to use that data for training my model, right? So it becomes more of a technical thing, because if you include all of that data, you're probably going to underestimate what you're doing, and so it won't be accurate.
Any other questions? Jason, maybe you could offer up like how you even got into data analytics.
I actually, I was so I did my, I did doctoral work at CU in the math department in computational mathematics. And I actually got into Twitter data. And that was kind of my introduction to big data. At the same time, I was seeing most of the doctoral students at CU leave and get jobs in like Kansas or northern Alberta. And I started knowing more and more developers around the Boulder area. So a lot of these things kind of went together, where I didn't want to go to northern Alberta. I didn't want to go somewhere that doesn't have mountains or good craft beer. And all of the developers that I knew in the area were absolutely in love with their jobs. So yeah, like one thing led to another. I took an internship and I got hired at that internship pretty quickly, and I actually stayed in grad school for still a few years after that while I was working. Luckily, data science was like just becoming a thing.
How did you get connected to those developers? Hang out at craft brewery places?
Yeah, playing softball, doing, all these things that people in the area that, work in software kind of tend to do, because they don't have their head in a book 100% of the time. Yeah, it was a good time to actually do it. And nowadays, I mean, yeah, we have somebody on my team that's doing like a data science master's at CU. So this is definitely a more well-developed field. But I will say, in terms of getting inspired in the area of doing the analytics that we're doing right now, like we did the CFD, the smart CFD, and moving forward with the Monte Carlo forecasting. One person who was incredibly influential in that was Scott Flores, who many of you probably know. He was the release train engineer at Rally, and he does show up he couldn't be here today, but he does show up to the Agile Boulder meetups, and we chat. When he was leaving Rally, he came over to me and he's like, "You should read these books." And that was kind of a life-changing moment for what I do at Rally. So that was really cool.
Awesome. Thank you. Any other questions from the community here? Any closing remarks from you, Jason?
I don't think so. Yeah, if you're a Rally customer, reach out and we can help you get going with some of this stuff.
Excellent. Well, I'll just recap on my announcements that were not a part of the recording. Just that Agile Boulder itself, my name's Sherry Soroka, and Agile Boulder itself, we have speakers all through October. And then we do take a break over the holidays, November and December, because we do meet the fourth Wednesday of every month. So those happen to fall over the holidays. So just historically, Agile Boulder has always taken that time off. And Agile Boulder does already have a speaker booked for January, so we're ready set for that. The Agile Denver board is going through a turnover. I'm not sure if you guys are aware. So June 20th is when the board will switch over. They are looking for nominations right now. So just reach out to, just look on the Agile Denver website and there's some information there on how to either nominate somebody. You are able to nominate yourself. And then the deadline for that, for any kind of nominations, is May 31st. And there will be some formality with it, some interviews that will take place. And so just so you guys are aware, there's a little bit of change going on with the community itself. Shouldn't really affect the the meetups that we have here that Agile Denver supports. They sponsor us effectively. They pay for my Google Suite. They pay for the meetup monthly fees and any kind of food if we decide to do anything in person. And so we will have some in-person events coming up in June. IHS Market in Boulder has been our host. Nobody at IHS Market is really going into the office, so it's kind of unusual that they're opening up their space for us to host next month. We will have a person, Barbara Van Heer, speaking. I know her through the context of she trains and teaches and certifies people in Brainerd Brown's Dare to Lead, and I'm certified in that. So she'll be talking on some sort of subject around that. And then in July, we will be at Uplight in Boulder. Lori Langston will be co-hosting that with me since she is now at Uplight. And we will have an author of a book who's going to be speaking and conducting some activities on psychological safety in June. So if you would like to be a future speaker for Agile Boulder, I do have a hyperlink in every single invite on the Agile Meetup. Each event, you'll see a hyperlink and you can submit information to be a future speaker. So I just wanted to give those few little announcements. Alex, you have a question about Trisha? Did Alex already drop? All right, that is all. Is she a speaker in July? So she was Trisha Broderick, I believe that's who you're speaking about. I thought she was going to be speaking for Agile Denver North, but I just saw that it looks like it's a different speaker, so maybe she had to rearrange, because I do know she's speaking for TechWell, the DevOps West. I know she's speaking, so maybe there's a conflict. So she is in our community. She is usually, you know, about somewhere she'll be speaking. So I haven't talked with the organizers of Agile Denver North as to the why. I did see Trisha was planned to speak, but it looks like it's been moved. So just keep an eye out for those things.
Well
All
done,
right.
y'all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. Have a wonderful evening.
You too. Bye.
Thank you, Jason, Cheryl.
Yep. Thank you. All right. Bye-bye.